I had all my easy classes now. I'm
gonna show you how good this pen reads.
In this first section, or this is actually a second. So our first section of this unit was about biochemistry. The second section now is about cells. And I split this up, like I said, my presentation on cells overall was like 60-something slides. So I split this into sections. This first section really is mainly a review. In 7th grade, you guys learned about all the cell parts, organelles, what they do, and so forth. So this section we're going to go through pretty quickly. We'll take maybe 4 or 5 days, and then we'll have a quick quiz probably next week, probably midweek next week, on cells and cell organelles. From there, we're going to get into more details. We're going to talk about photosynthesis, respiration, in far more detail than we did in 7th grade. Talk also about cell reproduction and the cell cycle and cancer to finish out with this section. So that's sort of where we're going. So the notes section we have now is basically review. But I want to start here with a couple of videos. This first one is interesting. This is so this video is an animation. It's pretty long. I might not watch all of it, but this animation sort of takes the information scientists have learned about cells and what cells are made of, how the different cell parts work together, and sort of animates it, makes it a visual, it turns it into a visual way to understand. Now, it is accurate. So scientists have been able to learn what are all the molecules that make up a cell, how they function, how do things move around within a cell, what do they look like, and so forth. Now the colors are artificial. Like this is a protein molecule. Okay, this is a big vesicle that's being dragged along this fiber. So probably this is what they actually look like in terms of their structure and shape. The colors are made up just to differentiate things so you can understand it better. But it's pretty interesting to see sort of what might be happening in our cells. When I took cell biology in graduate school, the way my professor taught our course was by going through sort of cell part by cell part and telling us about how did scientists learn that the mitochondria produces energy or extracts energy from glucose, and how did they learn what the function of the endoplasmic reticulum, what were the experiments they did. And so that's sort of how we learned about the parts of the cell. And so it's an interesting way to approach learning about the cell and the cell parts. And just to get us started, I want to show you this video that's kind of neat about the parts within the cell and how they might actually look. So it's got some really dramatic music too. It labels what these molecules are that you're seeing here. And these are white blood cells attaching to another cell to sort of start to destroy it. So just kind of some neat animation there to see all the different parts of the cell, like I said. So cells come in a variety of sizes, a variety of shapes, different complexities. And so, in 7th grade we talked about like a plant and animal cell. We just sort of drew a generalized plant or an animal cell, but they're really different parts of an animal have different types of cells. There's muscle cells and skin cells and nerve cells and so forth, and they each sort of have parts that match what they do, that allow them to fulfill their function. So we'll start by talking about cell theory. And cell theory is something we did talk about in 7th grade. It's sort of what the idea scientists have put together about cells that is very well established and has been around for hundreds of years. And this video tells the story of cell theory a little bit about
technology is changing
how it was
the way people
developed.
work and live.
Be willing to look very differently at your business. Be willing to think about what it would take to disrupt your traditional model, because if you don't do it, someone else will.
Great things about science is that when scientists make a discovery, it's not always in a prescribed manner, as in only in a laboratory under strict settings with white lab coats and all sorts of neat science gizmos that go beep. In reality, the events and people involved in some of the major scientific discoveries are as weird and varied as they get. My case in point, the weird history of the cell theory. There are 3 parts to the cell theory. 1, all organisms are composed of 1 or more cells. 2, the cell is the basic unit of structure, organization, in organisms. And 3, all cells come from pre-existing cells. To be honest, this all sounds incredibly boring until you dig a little deeper into how the world of microscopic organisms and this theory came to be. It all started in the early 1600s in the Netherlands, where a spectacle maker named Zacharias Janssen is said to have come up with the first compound microscope, along with the first telescope. Both claims are often disputed, as apparently he wasn't the only bored guy with a ton of glass lenses to play with at the time. Despite this, the microscope soon became a hot item that every naturalist or scientist at the time wanted to play with, making it much like the iPad of its day. One such person was a fellow Dutchman by the name of Anton van Leeuwenhoek, who heard about these microscope doohickeys, and instead of going out and buying one, he decided to make his own. And it was a strange little contraption indeed, as it looked more like a tiny paddle the size of a sunglass lens. If he had stuck 2 together, it probably would have made a wicked set of sunglasses that you couldn't see much out of. Anywho, once Leeuwenhoek had his microscope ready, he went to town looking at anything and everything he could with them, including the gunk on his teeth. Yes, you heard right. He actually discovered bacteria by looking at dental scrapings, which, when you keep in mind that people didn't brush their teeth much, if at all, back then, he must have had a lovely bunch of bacteria to look at. When he wrote about his discovery, he didn't call them bacteria as we know them today, but he called them animalcules because they looked like little animals to him. While Leeuwenhoek was staring at his teeth gunk, he was also sending letters to a scientific colleague in England by the name of Robert Hooke. Hooke was a guy who really loved all aspects of science, so he dabbled in a little bit of everything, including physics, chemistry, and biology. Thus it is Hooke who we can thank for the term the cell, as he was looking at a piece of cork under his microscope, and the little chambers he saw reminded him of cells, or the rooms monks slept in their monasteries. Think college dorm rooms, but without the TVs, computers, and really annoying roommates. Hooke was something of an underappreciated scientist of his day. Something he brought upon himself as he made the mistake of locking horns with one of the most famous scientists ever, Sir Isaac Newton. Remember when I said Hooke dabbled in many different fields? Well, after Newton published a groundbreaking book on how planets move due to gravity, Hooke made the claim that Newton had been inspired by Hooke's work in physics. Newton, to say the least, did not like that, which sparked a tense relationship between the two that lasted even after Hooke died, as quite a bit of Hooke's research, as well as his only portrait, was misplaced due to Newton. Much of it was rediscovered, thankfully, after Newton's time, but not his portrait, as sadly no one knows what Robert Hooke looked like. Fast forward to the 1800s, where two German scientists discovered something that today we might find rather obvious, but helped tie together what we now know as the cell theory. The first scientist was Matthias Schleiden, a botanist who liked to study plants under a microscope. From his years of studying different plant species, it finally dawned on him that every single plant he had looked at were all made of cells. At the same time, on the other end of Germany was Theodor Schwann, a scientist who not only studied slides of animal cells under the microscope and got a special type of nerve cell named after him, but also invented rebreathers for firefighters and had a kickin' pair of sideburns. After studying animal cells for a while, he too came to the conclusion that all animals were made of cells. Immediately, he reached out via snail mail, as Twitter had yet to be invented, to other scientists working in the same field, and it was Schleiden who got back to him, and the two started working on the beginnings of the cell theory. A bone of contention arose between them, as for the last part of the cell theory, that cells come from pre-existing cells, Schleiden didn't exactly subscribe to that thought, as he swore cells came from free cell formation, where they just kind of spontaneously crystallized into existence. That's when another scientist, named Rudolf Virchow, stepped in with research showing that cells did come from other cells. Research that was actually, how to put it, borrowed without permission from a Jewish scientist by the name of Robert Remak, which led to two more feuding scientists. Thus, from teeth gunk to torquing off Newton, crystallization to swan cells, the cell theory came to be an important part of biology today. Some things we know about science today may seem boring, but how we came to know them is incredibly fascinating. So if something bores you, dig deeper. It's probably got a really weird story behind it somewhere.
Right, so you see a little bit about the development of cell theory. So cell theory, scientists didn't really start to understand cells on any real level until microscopes were invented. So microscopes started to be used by grinding glass into lenses, which could magnify an image. In the 1600s, really, is when it became common. Anton van Leeuwenhoek was the one that made he's the one with the curly hair, probably a wig, right? He's the one that made these strange kind of microscopes where you would just hold them up, and they're a little plate of metal, and embedded in that metal was a little tiny glass lens that he made. His lenses were single lens microscopes, not compound microscopes with two lenses, but he was somehow able to fashion these lenses that could magnify an image up to 200 times, way more than any other lens maker at his time could do it. And he was very, very secretive about it. He wouldn't tell anybody how he made these lenses. When people would come to see the microscopes he was making, he'd only show them the inferior ones. He wouldn't show them his best microscopes because he wanted to sort of keep it to himself. And so, from what I read, the way he actually made these lenses, he put drops of liquid melted glass into water, and it would solidify and form these tiny little spheres that were very powerful in terms of their magnification. He looked at lots of things in his microscopes. He looked at blood cells, he looked at sperm cells, he looked at protists, single-celled organisms living in pond water, and saw all of these things. Robert Hooke was also working around the same time, and he used compound microscopes, okay, to observe mostly non-living material. He's the one that called them cells, okay, when he was looking at cork. And what he really was seeing was just the outline of the cell wall. They weren't living cells. He wasn't looking at organelles, but he called them, he's the one that named them cells. And he published his observations and drawings in 1665 in a book called Micrographia, which was basically all of his drawings that he made using his microscope. And so later on, it was, this is Robert Hooke too. Then Robert Brown was working a while later, almost 100 years later. Because after scientists started to learn that, okay, living things are made of these cells, you can see them in lots of living things, they started looking, okay, what's in a cell? What's in a living cell? What are the parts? And so Robert Brown discovered the nucleus and gave it its name. And he noticed that there's a small, dense structure that if you stain cells would show up and be more pronounced. And he found it in every cell that he looked at. It was then Schleiden and Schwann and Virchow that started to put together these ideas into what we today call cell theory. Schleiden was a botanist. He was observing the plant cells. Schwann was looking at animal cells. And they both started to realize that every single living organism they observed was made of cells. They started to say that these cells are the basic unit. That they are the building blocks of all living organisms. And then it was Virchow that sort of established the fact that these cells come from other cells. And they don't just pop into being randomly. They come from other cells. Cells reproduce to make new cells. All right, so the cell theory has 3 parts to it. And like any scientific theory, it's well established, confirmed by experiment after experiment, and accepted by scientists. And so it says, first of all, that cells are the basic unit of structure and organization of all living organisms. It also states that all organisms are composed of one or more cells. And then the third part says that cells come from other cells. So these ideas are sort of established and put together in the middle of the 1800s by Schwann and Schleiden and Virchow. And so we know that cells, regardless of whether they're a prokaryote, eukaryote, a complex organism, a simple organism, a plant, an animal, they all have a few specific things in common. All cells, first of all, have a plasma membrane, a cell membrane that surrounds them. All cells have that. All cells have, filling the inside of that plasma membrane, cytoplasm, sometimes called cytosol. Basically a like sort of semi-fluid like material where the organelles are found, where chemical reactions take place, and so forth. All cells have ribosomes, organelles, tiny structures that are used to make proteins. And they all have DNA. Every cell has DNA. Simple cells usually just have one single circular chromosome. Other cells have multiple chromosomes, but they all have DNA as the genetic material. So if we compare prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells, okay, prokaryotic cells are the simple cells. Bacteria, archaea, those are the 2 domains that are prokaryotic cells. So they don't have a nuclear membrane. Their DNA, they do have DNA, they do have a chromosome, but it's not located within a membrane like eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells, there's a nucleus, that's a membrane with pores in it, and the chromosomes are located there. In bacteria and archaea, the DNA is kind of within the cytoplasm, usually in a certain area that you can see, but it's there. They also, prokaryotic cells don't have membrane-bound organelles. They don't have mitochondria. They don't have Golgi bodies. They don't have ER. They don't have chloroplasts. They don't have any of those more complex organelles. They do go through some of the same processes. Photosynthesis can happen in prokaryotic cells. Respiration takes place in them, but not within these organelles that are surrounded by a membrane. Eukaryotic cells, they have these specialized membrane-bound organelles. Prokaryotic cells are usually small, much smaller than eukaryotic cells, between 0.1 and 10 micrometers. Eukaryotic cells are usually between 10 and 100 micrometers in size. Centrioles, these structures that help sort of organize the movement of materials within the cell, they are present in eukaryotes, absent in prokaryotes. And so this is an example. This shows a prokaryote. This is a bacterial cell. Then it has the plasma membrane. It has the cell walls. Many prokaryotes do have an outer non-living cell wall. Has inside of it some ribosomes, these little dots, has cytoplasm filling it, and then the nuclear material doesn't have a nucleus, it's called the nucleoid, but the DNA is sort of spread throughout the cytoplasm, not enclosed within the nuclear membrane, and it has a flagellum and some little sort of hair-like structures for locomotion. Okay, the last thing to talk about today is the organization of living things. Some living things are just made of cells. They don't have any higher level of organization. Let's finish this, then we can take a break. So the very simplest things are made of a single cell. Okay? They're made of chemicals that we've talked about, proteins, polysaccharides, nucleic acids, lipids, organized to form cells. That's the basic level. For example, here's just one single muscle cell. But in some organisms that are more complex, multicellular organisms, often individual cells work together. Okay? They form tissues. A bunch of smooth muscle cells form smooth muscle tissue that has a job to do. They work together. Smooth muscle tissue can contract involuntarily. So some organisms have that level of organization. For complex organisms, tissues work together, various types of tissues, to form an organ, like the stomach. The stomach is made of muscle tissue, also epithelial tissue, combined in a certain structure to form an organ. Okay? Organs combine and work together to form a full organ system, like the digestive system or the circulatory system. And then those various organ systems work together to form one complete organism. And that's the highest level of individual organization, complete organism. So that's what we call the organization of living things. Cell, tissue, organ system, organism. Any questions? All right, you guys can take a break for a couple minutes.
We're really keep doing those moves.
Nope, we're done with notes.